We welcome our internet audience, and we're glad that you are here worshiping with us today as we get into the Word of God. We invite you to get into it wherever you are, opening your Bibles, following along with us. Before we open the Word, we have the process, the ritual, the routine of inviting you to be engaged in daily Bible reading every day. The things we do the most are the things that shape us. The materials we read the most are the things that affect our thinking the most. So you're invited to follow a Bible reading plan. The one on the screen is the one we follow here at Stone Mountain Seventh-day Adventist Church. If you don't follow this one, follow one. And make sure that God is speaking to you every day. Of course, we encourage you to be in Bible reflection groups, Bible reading groups, Bible study groups. I understand there was a good one over towards Centerville, Loganville this week. And I understand the next one is ready to be planned. Make sure you're part of a group and that you're in the Word between Sabbaths. Today we continue in our sermon series entitled Reignite. Our sermon series is Reignite. Today's sermon is Revision. Revision. And we begin by looking at a passage of Scripture that most of us are familiar with, taking place in the Old Testament during the divided kingdom. And the king of Israel was being harassed and attacked by the Syrian king. If you recall the story of Naaman, he had taken a little girl prisoner before he came down with leprosy, taking her as a slave, actually. Before he came down with leprosy, and he had to go to Israel to get some healing for that leprosy. Well, it's around the same period of time. This time the king of Syria is trying to capture the king of Israel. So he would set up camp where he thought the king of Israel would be traveling, but Elisha would go to the king of Syria and tell him, you don't want to go that way. The Syrians are waiting for you. So the king of Israel would actually listen and find somewhere else to be. And then it would happen again and again. The text said it happened many times. Finally, the king of Syria is getting upset, and he's asking his people, who is on their side? Somebody in this group is on their side. And they say to him, no, it's none of us. There's this guy in Israel called Elisha. He hears what you say in your bedroom. This guy knows things. He may even know what you're thinking inside your head. And it's interesting as you pick up here at, here we go, verse 15, the text says, and when the servant, I jumped ahead of myself. So the king of Syria sends an army. I should have set that up. My apologies. The king of Syria sends an army to Israel. He's told that Elisha is in Dothan. So the army goes by night and surrounds Dothan. And in the morning, the sun is rising. And this is where we pick up. When the servant of the man of God arose early and went out, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and chariots. And his servant said to him, alas, my Lord, what shall we do? I don't know how many of you have said, alas, my Lord. I don't know if that's part of your regular vocabulary. But in the New International Version, he says, oh no, my Lord. In the Hebrew, the words are, my Lord. Sort of an automatopoeia that the sound of the word simply suggests the meaning of the word, like wow and It's that deep groan from inside that says, I'm in a mess. Perhaps today we'd say, grr, or whatever our expression is. The realization that things are not well. It's an expression of loss and hopelessness. I suspect we've been there. We've had our times where we cannot find words to express our predicament. We can't see our way out of our situation. We can't talk our way out of our situation. We can't negotiate our way out of our situation because we have nothing left to negotiate with. No matter what we do, we lose. And we don't know what to do. And there the servants of Elisha says, my Lord. It's kind of strange because he finds himself in a situation. He's in peril for his life as well as Elisha. But you know, my friends, sometimes it is God who puts us in those situations. In the case of Elisha, it was God who put him in that situation. Sometimes because you obey God, you find yourself jammed up. Because you obey God, things don't go right. Because you obey God, you find yourself and you find your life in peril because you obey God. And here Elisha had been faithful to God, and here Elisha had been doing what he'd been called to do as a prophet of God, and because of that, he is now surrounded by the enemy. And they have chariots and they have horses, and they can inflict some harm and some pain on Elisha. Sometimes the right thing gets us in trouble. I recall processing very carefully the call to come to Atlanta, Georgia, and to pastor the Stone Mountain Church. And I prayed and had dreams and read passages in God. And you've heard me tell my story, so I'm not going to tell it all over again. But God made it very clear to me, Joel, this is where I want you to go. So I came. And I thought because God led me here, things would be easy. Sometimes God brings you into trouble. For 5 months, I lived here without a home address. For 5 months, it was a hotel room. Now, if you're going to be homeless, this was not the worst way to be homeless, okay? But I was living in temporary residence in extended stay hotels for 5 months while the market was low. It took 5 months to find the right place to live. Sometimes because you keep the Sabbath, you discover you're no longer employed. You said, Lord, I'm going to do what you asked me to do, but then the problem comes. Because you made a decision for Christ and you stepped out in faith, now your finances fall apart. Because you decided that your children deserve Christian education, now you find yourself in a bind and you find yourself having they find themselves having disciplinary problems at school. Because you do the right thing, sometimes things go bad. And it lets us know that good outcomes don't always mean good choices. And bad outcomes don't always mean bad choices. You can do the right thing and have a bad situation as a result of it. See, cause and effect don't always line up properly. So we, like Elisha's servant, cry out, alas, my master, what shall we do? But Elisha answered him according to verse 16 and 17. He said, do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. Then the Lord Yahweh opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountains were full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. What if we could see like that? What if we could see things differently? What if we could see things the way God sees things? What if the blinders would fall off of our eyes and see things for what they really are rather than how they appear? Because not everything is the way it appears. My friends, I'm here to tell you this afternoon that we need divine vision to achieve God's plans. What do you say? Carnal vision will only cause us to fear and despair. We need divine vision to see things properly. We need divine vision to get proper understanding. We need a divine perspective to make it through our lives. if we're going to live for God, if we're going to make a difference in this world, if we're going to reflect the image of God in this world, we need divine vision. God calls us to look at life differently. He calls us to look at life spiritually. He calls us to look at life through a lens of faith. And therefore, we cannot get rattled by everything that we see. We cannot lose hope every time we're in a jam, because sometimes God needs us in a jam. Sometimes God needs us where things are not going well. Sometimes God needs us where things are going bad. Why? Because when we're in a jam and everything looks hopeless, that's when God can be seen the most. Sometimes it takes a mountain. Sometimes it takes a desert. Sometimes it takes that valley experience for God to be seen and get a hold of somebody and get a hold of us sometimes. What we see is not all there is, my brothers and sisters. We need a divine vision because vision guides our lives. Visions guide our lives. Visions change our perspective. When we see things differently, we understand differently. Visions adjust our priorities. You know, as long as we don't have vision, we don't need priorities. As long as we don't have a plan, we don't have to prioritize this. As long as there's not an end goal, it doesn't matter what we do. But when we have a divine vision, it guides our lives. Let me share with you a story that back in Exodus 3, God shared a vision with one of his servants. Now, Moses had grown up most of his life in Egypt, and he had been told the stories of his birth and how he was put in a basket and his life was saved. And he actually grew up in Pharaoh's house, and perhaps at a young age, he had a sense of purpose. He felt that he was in this world for something great. And perhaps it was ingrained from his parents' home that his role was to save God's people. So as he grew and opportunity came his way and power came his way, he was about and he saw an injustice against God's people. And he decided, this is my opportunity. This is the moment I was born for. This is my time in history. This is time for me to step up and to make a name for myself and to do something that makes a difference. So the text tells us that Moses killed the Egyptian and buried him. Now, he would have imagined that his people would have rallied around him and the Israelites would have been proud of him, and perhaps he could start a revolt and lead them into freedom, overpower the Egyptians. I don't know what he had in his mind, but it must have been something great for him to do that. And yet the word got out, and when he discovered the word got out and it even made it to Pharaoh, he realized he was in deep trouble because there wasn't a single Israelite near him. In fact, one Israelite asked him when he was trying to mediate between a conflict, one Israelite asked him, are you going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian? He knew things didn't go quite right for him, so he fled into the Midian desert. And he was sentenced, or should we say sentenced himself, to 40 years of hard labor. Now, Moses probably thought he had been sentenced to a life of hard labor because for 40 years, it's the same old thing. He had been trained in the best of schools. He'd had the best education. He knew how to do strategic planning and how to lead forces. He had the education, and all of this going for what? To lead sheep. To walk around in the desert, leading sheep where they can find little sprigs of grass and a little patch of greenery here so they can eat. That was his job for 40 years. What have you been doing for the last 40 years? And think about Moses' life for the last 40 years. That's all he's doing, the same thing, day in and day out. Just leading sheep. And perhaps for weeks at a time, he would experience the guilt of what he did and how he got to his situation and just simply accept that his life had been a total failure. Whatever he was born for, whatever greatness he had aspired to, that wasn't going to happen. This is your life. But one day the text tells us that as he was out there in the wilderness, he saw a fire. And what was distinct about this fire is the bush that contained the fire was still green. And he's saying, that's odd. I haven't seen that before. That's a new thing. And he keeps looking and it keeps staying green. And the longer he looks, the greener it is. And there's not a whole lot of green out in the desert, by the way. So that would have certainly gotten his attention. And he approaches it and he hears the voice of God saying, Moses, take off your shoes because where you're standing is holy ground. And we get into the text as the conversation goes on, beginning at verse 7. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them up from the land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression of the Egyptians. The Egyptians oppressed them. Come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. I don't know if you see what's going on here, but God has just given Moses a new vision for life. Moses' vision for his life was, this is it. This is my life. I play with sheep. I walk around with sheep. I smell like sheep. I sleep with sheep. I wake up with sheep. Sheep, sheep, sheep. This is my life. But God stepped into the picture and gave Moses a new vision of his life. He says, I'm going to take them to a land of milk and honey, a broad land. We're going to new places. My friends, vision guides us. Vision guides our lives. It changes our perspectives. It changes our priorities. It changes our plans. After this encounter with God, do you think Moses woke up the next day and planned to tend sheep? Do you think Moses was concerned about sheep after this moment? No. Vision guides what we do, and it guides our priorities. Here's the thing, though. All of us are led by vision. All of us are led by vision. Here's the question for you. Whose vision is it? Is it God's vision? Is it your vision, or is it someone else's vision? Whose vision is leading your life? See, because if it's God's vision, it's going to take you to good places. It may take you through rough patches. It may take you through the desert, but you're going to end up in a good land if it's God's vision. If it's God's vision, you're going to want to be where God wants to lead. But understand, on the way, you're going to find some places you don't really like. But that's God's vision. We're always working toward a vision. If we're not working towards God's vision, quite often we're working for either our vision or someone else's vision. Now, truth be told, most of us are working for someone else's vision. If you have a job, you're working for someone else's vision. Because somebody decided they should start a company and produce this product or sell a certain type of service. And they had this dream and they turned it into a vision. And they decided that they should go large. And they hired you to fulfill their vision. If you get a W-2, you're fulfilling somebody else's vision. If you're taking medication, I want you to know you're fulfilling somebody else's vision. Because at some point, somebody had a vision of coming up with a medication to treat a certain problem. And in their vision, they imagine people just like you buying their products. If you're watching TV, you're living somebody else's vision. Because long ago, somebody came up with the idea of transmitting signals into the sky and having receivers in different places and enabling people to see things in a box and being able to spend their time there. And if you're spending your time there, you're living their vision. If you spend a lot of time on the internet, I want you to know that you live in somebody else's vision. You're working towards somebody else's vision because one day somebody came up with this great plan. Let's design a website that will capture people's attention. And let's design a book about faces so that people can spend a lot of time there. Some of you know about the book about faces. And let's just capture them and make sure they're sitting there for an hour or 2 or 3, just spending time on our site so that we can sell advertisements and make money. We're living other people's visions. If you're working for yourself and you're investing all of your life and time into your work, yes, you're working for your vision, but how far will your vision get you? What will it do for you? Can your vision be any better than God's vision? Is there any chance whatsoever, your vision for your life can be better than God's vision for your life? I don't know what you're inclined to answer to that question, but I can guarantee you that God's vision is better than yours. See, it was God's vision for us that changed things for us. It was God's vision for us that got him to come to the earth in the person of Jesus. It was God's vision for us that caused him to put up with our abuse and the way we treated him. It was his vision for us that caused him to die the shame of the cross. Because God had a vision for us, and he has a vision for us into eternity. It was a vision for a world reconciled to God that drove the apostles all over the world to talk about Jesus. It was that vision for eternity that led Paul to be beaten and Peter to be crucified and other apostles to be burned and sawed in half, because the vision was so powerful it affected what they did. Visions guide our lives. Visions guide our decisions. Visions guide our actions. Visions make things happen. Everything that is a result of a vision. Do you realize that? We are the result of God's vision. Every building is a result of somebody's vision. Every chair, every car, every road, everything that exists in the material world is the result of someone's vision. So here's the question to ponder before we let you go. How do visions become reality? How do visions become reality? Here come 3 points in a song. Here we go. First point, God provides us revelation. Take a look at Joel chapter 2. Joel chapter 2. I know you're familiar with this passage out of Acts chapter 2, but in Acts they're quoting Joel chapter 2. And the text says, beginning in verse 28, and it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, for your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions, and also on my men servant and my maid servants I will pour out my spirit in those days. God says he's going to pour out his spirit. My friends, God provides revelation for our visions. What do you say? God provides what we need for our visions. He says he will give it to us. Divine visions are divinely revealed. They are not concocted. Divine visions are what we receive from God. We do not generate them. But I hope you notice in that passage that every generation had a vision. Every generation had an outpouring from God. He said, I will pour them out on what? Your sons and your daughter. Said what? Who gets to dream? Who gets to dream according to the prophet Joel? Who gets to see visions according to the prophet Joel? Even on the manservant and on the maidservants, he would pour out his spirit. By the way, what's Why do the old men dream and the young men see vision? Why don't the old men see vision? You ever wonder? May I suggest this to you? I heard something about expire. I didn't hear the whole thing. May I suggest this to you? Dreams and visions are pretty much the same thing. Some believe some happen when you sleep and some when you're awake. But if you've ever been to school and found yourself daydreaming, you realize that dreams happen while you're awake too. And visions can happen in your sleep. But the difference is this: a vision gets followed up with action. A dream is just received. And therefore, the old men dream dreams because they're at a stage in life where they no longer have the strength to execute the dream. But the young men must have vision because it's up to them to turn that vision into reality. And God is giving the young men visions, and God is giving young people vision, and God is giving us vision so that we can bring about God's plan, providing we stay in God's will. Every generation has a vision. God is calling us to dream dreams. God is calling us to see visions. The question is, are we willing? Are we willing? Or are we too satisfied living somebody else's vision? Are we too satisfied living in a vision from yesterday? My friends, we will live someone else's vision, or we will experience the vision that God has for us. The question is, which one do we want? God has a vision that includes each one of us. We need to embrace it. So that's one. God provides the revelation. But there's a bit more. There's a bit more. Not only does God provide the revelation, we experience inspiration when we receive that revelation. When we finally get it, and I realize there are many people walking around that don't have a sense of God's revelation. But when we finally get it, when we pay enough attention, when we're sufficiently submitted to get that revelation, then we experience inspiration. Perhaps the same inspiration that the prophets of old experienced. Jeremiah was fussing about his experience. He would prophesy. God called him, as he does the prophets, to prophesy, and he would tell of things to come. Now, if you're a prophet, life can get very inconvenient because you've got to make statements that people don't want to hear. And here you are saying to God's people, destruction is coming, but people are prospering. Here you're telling people that destruction is coming, but life has never been better. And so they get tired of hearing Jeremiah, and they persecute and prosecute him. They make his life miserable. If you read the book, you know he ends up in the dungeon several times and in prison. And Jeremiah gets so frustrated, he's arguing with God, and he's wrestling with God, and he said, you induced me into this. This wasn't my plan. I'm a derision every day. I spoke, I cried out violence and plunder, but now I'm everybody's derision. They don't respect me, God. Take a look at what he says here in verse 9. Then I said, I will not make mention of him, speaking of God, nor speak anymore in his name. But what? But his word was in my heart like a burning fire, shut up in my bones. I was weary of holding it back, and I could not. You know what? When God's revelation gets a hold of you, when God's revelation gets on the inside of you, when God's revelation becomes your inspiration, my friends, you can't hold it back. When God gets a hold of you, it's from the inside coming out, and you just have to be about what God is about. When God gets up inside of you, you can't hold it back because it will kill you if you do. And yet, I see God's people holding it in. Is the reason Paul would tell the church at Thessalonica, do not quench the spirit. Don't despise the prophecies. Test all things. My friends, God's revelation leads to our inspiration. And when that happens, it is fire in our bones. And we've got to be able to tell what God tells us to tell and do what God tells us to do and go where God tells us to go and be what God tells us to be. God's vision moves us from the inside. Let me give you a third point. When we experience the revelation and we experience the inspiration, then we need to engage in cooperation. Let's go back to Moses in the desert. He has that encounter with God, and what happens at the end of that conversation with God? What does God say to Moses? Come now, verse 10, come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Did you notice that turn in the passage? I have heard the cries of my people. I've seen their sorrows. I have come down to deliver them. Because I've heard their sorrows. Come now, you go deliver them. Now, it's kind of crazy because God really doesn't need us at all. We are the most unneeded things in the world. God doesn't need us, and yet God insists on using us. He could do it all by himself, but he refuses to. He insists that he is going to work out his will on this earth through you and through me. God says, go now, I'm sending you. Moses didn't have the option to sit around and pray. Moses didn't have the option of another program, of another service. Moses didn't have the option of contemplating forever. This wasn't about a Bible study. This was about action. Go and deliver my people. My friends, there are times we simply have to do. When God calls us, we simply have to do. But let me say this as I wrap up. Miracles happen when we cooperate with God. Miracles happen when we cooperate with God. That's why he uses the mountains. That's why he uses the valleys. That's why he uses the fires. Miracles happen when we cooperate with God. That's why God promises us visions so that miracles can happen in our lives. Just think about the myriad of miracles that took place in Moses' life. He had the snake miracle. He had the leprosy miracle. He had the gnats miracle, the blood miracle, the fly miracle, the frog miracle, the sea miracle, the river miracle, the quails miracle, the water miracle, the manna miracle. He had the battles miracle. Practically every day of his life, you would think there was another miracle. But that's what happens when we cooperate with God. Now ask yourself a question. Where's the miracle in your life? Where's the miracle? Are we cooperating with God? Are we doing what God has called us to do? Can we see the miracles in our lives? Can we see God leading us? Are we too busy seeing somebody else's vision fulfilled in our lives? Moses came to the end of the road and he would have made it into the promised land. But he lost sight for a few moments and he got out of place, and God said, you're not going to see the promised land. He took him up to the top of the mountain. He said, why don't you lay down, take a rest? I got something better for you, but you're not going to lead the children in. So he called Joshua, Moses' servant. And in chapter 5, the first couple of verses, he says to Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore rise and go over this Jordan. Take a look at verse 5, though. He says, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. How many of you have claimed that promise before? I will not leave you nor forsake you. You've heard it. You've said it. Here's the question. Did you realize this promise is conditional on following God's vision? Did you realize that this promise is conditional on doing what God said to do and going where God said to go? See, as long as we're working towards God's vision, this is a promise that applies to our lives. It says, I will be with you the same way I was with Moses. I will not leave you nor forsake you. My friends, if we want to see miracles in our lives, we need to be working towards God's vision. What do you say? Come on up, praise team. I'm done. Are there miracles in your lives? Whose vision are you living for? What are you pursuing? You're working towards somebody's vision. Who is it? Whose is it? May I appeal to you. Let's work towards God's vision.